The back door moved slowly. Not wide, just enough for someone to slip inside quietly. I was standing in the dark hallway watching it happen. The house was half torn apart because of the renovation. Plastic sheets hanging from the ceiling. Tools everywhere. The power off in half the rooms. Most people would think nobody was here. That's exactly what she thought. Karen pushed the door open another inch and peeked inside like she was checking if the place was empty. Behind me, 6 SWAT officers were standing silent against the walls. Black uniforms, vests, no lights on, just waiting. One of them leaned close and whispered, "That her?" I nodded slowly without taking my eyes off the door. "Yeah, that's her." Karen stepped inside. She held a flashlight and moved it slowly across the room, shining it over the covered furniture and the stacks of lumber on the floor. She looked nervous, but also confident, like someone who thought they were about to prove a point. Behind her, 2 other people followed in. One was the HOA guy who had been threatening me all week. The other was a tow truck driver. Yes, a tow truck driver. "Inside my house," Karen whispered loudly. "See? I told you nobody's here." The HOA guy looked around the construction mess and laughed quietly. "She hasn't lived here in days. We can document everything." Tow truck guy scratched his head. "Lady, I still don't understand why you needed me." Karen pointed her flashlight toward the driveway outside. "Because once we prove the house is abandoned, that truck gets removed tonight." I felt my jaw tighten. My truck, parked in my own driveway. She had already taped 3 fake HOA violation notices on my front door this week saying my property was under investigation. Now she was breaking inside to collect evidence. The SWAT officer beside me whispered again, "You want us to stop them now?" I shook my head. "Not yet." Karen walked deeper into the house. Her flashlight beam moved across the living room, then the kitchen, then toward the hallway where we were standing in the shadows. She stopped suddenly. Her light landed on something. Not us. The security camera mounted above the hallway. Karen froze. "Wait," she said slowly. The HOA guy stepped closer. "What?" She pointed the flashlight at the camera again. Why would an abandoned house have live cameras? I stepped forward out of the dark. "Good question." Karen screamed and jumped back so hard she almost dropped the flashlight. "What the hell?" Then the lights flipped on. Bright white construction lights flooded the room. 6 SWAT officers stepped forward behind me at the same time. The tow truck driver dropped his keys. The HOA guy's face turned pale. Karen just stared at me. Completely frozen, I folded my arms and looked at the broken door she forced open. Then back at her. "You broke into my house?" "With witnesses," I said calmly. Karen finally found her voice. You can't be here." I raised an eyebrow. "Funny, because this is literally my house." She shook her head fast and pointed at the hallway. No, you said you moved out during the renovation." "I said I was staying somewhere else temporarily." Her voice started getting louder. "You lied to the HOA." One of the SWAT officers behind me chuckled quietly. Karen turned toward them. "And what are they doing here?" she demanded. Before I could answer, one of the officers stepped forward slowly. "Ma'am, you might want to calm down." Karen pointed at me like she had just discovered something. "Wait a second." Her eyes narrowed. "You called them here." I shrugged. Well, technically they were already here. The room went silent. Karen looked around at the officers again, then back at me. "Why would a SWAT team be hiding in your house?" I looked her straight in the eyes. "Because 3 hours ago, someone reported that this house was about to be broken into tonight." Karen's face slowly changed. Confusion, then worry, then anger. "You set me up." I tilted my head slightly. "No, Karen." I pointed at the busted door behind her. "You did that part all by yourself." Karen looked at the broken door, then back at me, then at the 6 SWAT officers standing in my living room. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. You could actually hear the plastic sheets from the renovation moving slightly in the air. Then Karen laughed. Not a nervous laugh, an arrogant one. "Oh, please," she said, waving her hand like none of this mattered. "You're trying to scare me." The tow truck driver still looked confused. He was standing near the door like he had just walked into the wrong movie. "Ma'am, you said this place was abandoned." Karen ignored him. She stepped forward and pointed at me. You think this little stunt changes anything? This property is under HOA investigation. One of the SWAT officers raised an eyebrow. Investigation for what? Karen turned to him with instant confidence. Illegal occupancy, construction violations, and unauthorized parking. I almost smiled. Unauthorized parking, in my own driveway. The HOA guy behind her cleared his throat and tried to sound official. We posted notices 3 days ago. I shook my head slowly. You mean the fake ones you printed in your office? Karen snapped back instantly. They were not fake. I stepped toward the table beside the wall and picked up a folded piece of paper. The same paper she taped to my door. I held it up. You mean this one? Karen's eyes flicked to it for a second. Then she shrugged. Yes, I unfolded it slowly. The SWAT officers watched quietly. So this says the HOA has authority to seize property if the owner fails to respond to violations, I said. Karen folded her arms proudly. Exactly. I looked up at her. That would be impressive. I flipped the paper over. This neighborhood actually had an HOA. The silence that followed felt heavy. The tow truck driver looked from me to Karen, then back to me. Wait, what? Karen's face tightened. That's not true. The officer beside me spoke calmly. Ma'am, we already checked. There is no registered HOA for this road. Karen shook her head quickly. That's ridiculous. The HOA guy behind her suddenly looked uncomfortable. Karen turned toward him. Tell them, he swallowed. Well, technically it's a community association. I raised an eyebrow. Oh, registered where? He didn't answer. Karen stepped forward again, her voice rising. It doesn't matter. The residents agreed to rules. I leaned against the counter. Residents can agree to whatever they want. Then I pointed at the ground beneath her feet. But you don't get to break into someone's house to enforce it. Karen opened her mouth but stopped. For the first time. She didn't have a quick answer. The SWAT officer near the window spoke quietly. Ma'am, did you force entry into this house tonight? Karen hesitated. The tow truck driver spoke before she could. Yeah, she did. Karen spun around. Don't start with me. He held his hands up. Lady, I just came to move a truck. The officer looked at the broken lock. Door frame is splintered. Then he looked at me. You want to press charges? Karen scoffed loudly. Oh my God, are you serious? She turned back to me like this was all some kind of game. You called a SWAT team over a door? I shook my head slowly. No. Then I nodded toward the hallway. I called them because of the threats. Karen's eyes narrowed. What threats? One of the officers pulled a tablet from his vest. You mean the phone calls? Karen blinked. What phone calls? The officer tapped the screen and turned it toward her. The audio started playing. Her voice filled the room. If you don't move that truck by tomorrow, we'll remove it ourselves. Karen's face changed slightly. The officer tapped again. Another recording. And if you try to come back here, we'll make sure you regret it. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. The officer looked at her calmly. That one was yesterday. Karen looked at me again. You recorded me? I shrugged. You were yelling in my driveway? The HOA guy behind her suddenly stepped backward like he wanted distance from this situation. Karen noticed. Where are you going? She snapped. He didn't answer. The officer watching him said quietly, Sir, you might want to stay where you are. The tow truck driver slowly raised his hand. Look, I really think I should leave. The officer shook his head slightly. Not yet. Karen ran a hand through her hair and looked around the house like she was trying to regain control. This is harassment, she said. No, I replied calmly. This is documentation. She pointed at the SWAT officers again. And why exactly are they here? The officer beside me finally answered. Because someone also reported that a group planned to illegally remove property tonight. Karen laughed again. That's insane. Then the officer tapped the tablet again. Another recording started. A man's voice this time. The HOA guy's voice. If the owner isn't here, we'll tow the truck tonight. The man behind Karen froze. Slowly. Everyone turned to look at him. He tried to smile. That's taken out of context. Karen stared at him. You said that? He stammered. Well, we thought the property was abandoned. I stepped forward again. You checked my mailbox. Karen frowned. So? So you saw my mail inside? She said nothing. You saw the construction permits posted on the wall. Karen stayed quiet. You even talked to my contractor last week. The SWAT officer looked interested. You knew someone was working here? Karen tried to recover. That doesn't prove he lives here. I walked to the kitchen counter and picked up a small stack of papers. Then I tossed them onto the table. Utility bills, electric, water, internet, all from this week. Karen stared at them. You forged those. One of the officers actually laughed. Ma'am, that's not how bills work. The tow truck driver rubbed his face. This is crazy. Karen suddenly turned toward him again. You're still towing that truck. He shook his head immediately. No way. Her eyes widened. You work for me tonight. He pointed toward the SWAT officers. I work for my license. Karen's confidence cracked slightly. You're all overreacting. The officer beside the door finally stepped closer. Ma'am, you entered this home without permission. Karen raised her voice again. I had authority. From who? The HOA. The officer paused, then said calmly, The HOA that doesn't exist? Karen didn't answer. She looked at me again like she was trying to figure something out. You planned this. I shrugged again. No. Then I nodded toward the door. But I did expect you. Her eyes narrowed. How? I walked over to the wall where one of the security monitors was sitting. Then I turned it on. The screen lit up. Camera footage from earlier that evening. Karen standing across the street, watching the house. Another clip. Karen talking to the HOA guy beside his car. Another clip. Karen pointing at my truck and talking to the tow truck driver. The room went silent again. Karen stared at the screen. You were spying on me. I looked at her. It's called security. One of the officers leaned toward the screen. You've got cameras on the street too? Just the ones pointing at my property. Karen's voice dropped lower. You can't record people without permission. The officer beside her shook his head. Actually, you can if they're standing in front of your house. Karen looked like she wanted to scream. Instead, she crossed her arms again. You're still violating HOA rules. I tilted my head. You're still standing inside my house. Another long silence followed. Then the officer beside me said something quietly. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time. Karen looked at him. Did you break into this house? Karen hesitated. Just for a second, but it was enough. The tow truck driver pointed at the door. She kicked it. Karen spun around. Shut up! The officer wrote something on a small notepad. Karen's breathing was getting heavier now. This is ridiculous. Then she suddenly pointed at me again. You're not even the real owner! That made the officer stop writing. He looked at me. Karen saw the reaction and jumped on it immediately. Yeah, that's right. She looked around the room like she had just won something. He's not the owner. The officer asked calmly. Then who is? Karen smiled. The property belongs to the development group. The HOA guy's head snapped toward her. What? Karen ignored him. She looked straight at me. I checked the records. I slowly leaned back against the counter again. Oh, you did? Yes. And what did they say? Karen's smile grew. That the land was purchased 2 months ago. The officers looked at me again. Karen pointed proudly. He's trespassing. The tow truck driver blinked. Wait, what? Karen crossed her arms again. Which means all of this is illegal. The room felt quiet again. One of the officers finally spoke. Sir, do you have proof of ownership? I looked at Karen. She looked very proud of herself now, like she had finally flipped the situation. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Karen smirked. Let me guess. Another fake document? I unlocked the screen and handed the phone to the officer. He looked at it. Then his eyebrows lifted slightly. Karen noticed immediately. What? The officer turned the screen so the others could see. Then he said quietly, Well, that's interesting. Karen's smile faded. What is it? The officer looked at her. According to county records, he paused, then finished the sentence. The development group didn't buy the property. Karen frowned. That's impossible. The officer looked back at the phone again, then at me. You bought it. Karen blinked. Once, twice. What? I nodded slowly. 2 months ago. The HOA guy's mouth fell open. Karen shook her head. No, I shrugged. Yeah. The officer handed me my phone back. Karen stared at me like the floor had disappeared under her feet. You're lying. I pointed toward the security screen still playing footage. You watched me renovate it for 3 weeks. Karen didn't respond. I stepped a little closer. You watched contractors come and go. Still nothing. You saw my truck every morning. Karen finally spoke again. But the record said the owner was a company. I nodded. They did. Karen's voice came out quieter now. What company? I looked straight at her. The one I own. The room went completely silent again. Even the tow truck driver stopped moving. Karen's face slowly changed. Confusion, then realization, then panic. You're saying... She swallowed. You own this house? I nodded once. And the land around it. Karen's eyes widened. How much land? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I walked to the window and looked out toward the dark street. Then I said calmly, everything from that corner. I pointed down the road. To the lake. The HOA guy whispered under his breath. Oh, no. Karen turned toward him. What? He looked at her like she had just walked off a cliff. That's the whole neighborhood. Karen slowly looked back at me. You're bluffing. I shook my head. No. Then I said the one sentence that made the room freeze. The HOA rules you've been enforcing? I paused. Apply to my land. Karen's mouth slowly opened. And for the first time that night, she had absolutely nothing to say. Karen stared at me like the words had just broken something inside her head. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she laughed again. But this time, it sounded forced. That's impossible, she said quickly. You can't just own an entire neighborhood. The SWAT officer near the window crossed his arms. Actually, people do that all the time. Karen shook her head. No, I checked the records. I nodded. You checked the old ones. Her eyes narrowed. What does that mean? I walked over to the table and picked up a dusty blueprint from the renovation plans. Then I rolled it open slowly. The plastic sheet hanging above us moved slightly as the air shifted. Karen and the others stepped closer without even realizing it. This land used to belong to a ranch family, I said calmly. The tow truck driver leaned a little to see the map. Used to? I pointed to a thick red line across the blueprint. 20 years ago, they sold most of it to a developer. Karen folded her arms again. Exactly. But, I continued, sliding my finger along the edge of the map. They kept this section. My finger stopped around the house. And the lake behind it. Karen's confidence started slipping again. That doesn't matter. I looked up at her. It does if the developer never finished buying the rest. One of the SWAT officers leaned closer to the blueprint. So the land stayed private? I nodded. For 20 years. Karen shook her head again. But the neighborhood was built here. Yeah, I said. Then I tapped the map again. On land they didn't fully own. The HOA guy behind her whispered quietly, almost to himself. That's why the HOA paperwork was never finalized. Karen turned toward him instantly. What are you talking about? He looked nervous now. Well, remember when the county rejected the registration 3 times? Karen's face hardened. That was paperwork delays. The man didn't answer. Instead, he looked down at the blueprint again. I could see the moment he understood. Oh, no, he muttered. Karen grabbed his arm. Explain, he swallowed. If the ranch family still owned the land under part of the neighborhood... He looked at me. Then the HOA never had legal authority. Karen's face slowly turned red. That's ridiculous. I leaned against the counter. Again, you've been collecting HOA fines for 3 years. Karen snapped back instantly. For maintenance. For what maintenance, I asked. She opened her mouth, then paused. The street outside our houses had potholes. The park lights barely worked. Even the sidewalks were cracked. The SWAT officer beside the door spoke calmly. Ma'am, were those fines reported to the county? Karen didn't answer. The tow truck driver looked between us. Wait, hold on. He pointed toward Karen. You mean she's been charging people money? Without a real HOA? The HOA guy looked like he wanted to disappear. Karen snapped at him. Stop talking. Then she turned back to me. You think this changes anything? I tilted my head slightly. It changes quite a lot. She pointed at the broken door again. You staged this whole thing. No, I replied. You just walked into it. Karen's breathing was heavier now. You tricked me. I shrugged. I told you 3 times to stop coming onto my property. One of the officers nodded. He did. Karen turned toward them. You're all taking his side. The officer answered calmly. We're taking the law's side. That made Karen laugh again. But there was panic in it now. Law, she said. Then she pointed at me again. He's lying about owning the neighborhood. I pulled my phone out again and tapped the screen. Then I tossed it gently onto the table. County property records were open. The officer closest to the table leaned over and looked. Then he let out a quiet whistle. Well, that's pretty clear. Karen didn't want to look. What does it say? She demanded. The officer read it out loud. Parcel group. Karen stared at me like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. For a long moment, she didn't move. The confidence she walked into my house with was gone now. You're lying, she said quietly. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked to the window and looked out toward the street. The construction lights behind me were bright enough to light the whole yard. My truck was still sitting in the driveway. The same truck she tried to tow 3 times this week. Behind me, I heard one of the SWAT officers clear his throat. County records already confirmed it, ma'am. Karen slowly turned toward him. What records? The officer nodded toward my phone in my hand. The deed! Karen looked back at me. Show me. Her voice sounded different now. Not angry, desperate. I walked over and placed the phone on the table. The document was still open on the screen. Karen stepped closer. The HOA guy leaned over beside her. They both stared at the screen for several seconds. Then the HOA guy's face went pale. Oh my God, Karen whispered. What? He pointed at the name on the document. That's him. Karen shook her head. No. I folded my arms. Yes. She looked back at me slowly. You bought the whole development? Not the development, I said calmly. The land. The tow truck driver let out a quiet whistle. That's a lot of land. Karen still looked like she was trying to process it. But the developer owned this area. They did, I said, until they ran out of money. Karen frowned. So you bought it? I nodded. 2 months ago. The SWAT officer near the wall added quietly, for several $1 million. Karen blinked. You're telling me this entire neighborhood? I finished the sentence for her. Is built on land I own. The room went silent again. Karen looked like she wanted to argue, but every direction she turned there was another wall closing in. The HOA guy suddenly stepped away from her. I didn't know about this. Karen turned toward him quickly. You told me the HOA had authority here. He raised both hands. I said we could enforce neighborhood standards. Karen pointed toward me. He's the problem. The SWAT officer spoke calmly. Ma'am, the problem right now is the door you broke. Karen looked back at the shattered frame. The reality finally started sinking in. She took a slow breath. You set this up. I shook my head again. No. Then I pointed at the door. You did that part? She looked at the officers again. So what now? You arrest me? The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me. You want to press charges? Karen stared at me. For the first time that night, there was actual fear in her eyes. Not anger. Fear. I was trying to protect the neighborhood, she said. I raised an eyebrow. By breaking into my house? She didn't answer. I walked over to the broken door and looked at the splintered wood. Then I turned back toward the room. You threatened me all week, I said. Karen's voice came out small. You threatened the neighborhood. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said quietly, you tried to tow my truck from my own driveway. Karen looked down. You posted fake violation notices. Silence. You called contractors and told them to stop working here. The contractor tools scattered around the room suddenly made more sense to everyone. Karen still said nothing. I sighed and looked at the SWAT officer. Go ahead. The officer nodded once. He stepped forward. "Ma'am, turn around, please." Karen's head snapped up. "You're serious?" The officer didn't change his expression. "Turn around." Karen looked at the HOA guy like she expected him to help. He looked away. That was the moment she realized she was alone. Slowly, she turned around. The officer gently placed handcuffs around her wrists. The metal clicked. The sound echoed through the half-empty house. The tow truck driver muttered under his breath. "Damn." Karen spun around as much as the cuffs allowed. "This is insane!" The officer calmly began reading her rights. The HOA guy quietly stepped toward the door. Another officer stopped him. "Not so fast." The man froze. "I didn't break anything," he said quickly. The officer nodded. "But you did plan the tow." He swallowed. "I thought the house was abandoned." The officer pointed at the cameras on the wall. "You also threatened the owner on recorded audio." The man's shoulders dropped. Karen watched him like she couldn't believe he wasn't defending her. "You're just going to let them arrest me?" she snapped. He shook his head. "You're the one who kicked the door." Karen looked like she wanted to scream. But there was nothing left to argue. The officers started guiding her toward the front door. As she passed me, she stopped. "You're destroying this neighborhood," she said. I looked at her calmly. "No." Then I nodded toward the broken door. "You tried to." She was quiet for a second. Then the officers walked her outside. The flashing red and blue lights from the patrol cars filled the street. Neighbors were standing on their porches watching. Some had phones out. Karen noticed. Her face turned red. The officer placed her into the back of the car. The door closed. The HOA guy stood beside the driveway looking like he wished he could disappear. One of the officers walked over to him. "We'll need you to come down to the station as well." "For what?" he asked nervously. "False reporting, intimidation, and attempted property seizure." His face dropped. "I didn't know he owned it." The officer shrugged. "You probably should have checked." The patrol car slowly pulled away. The street became quiet again. The tow truck driver stood beside his truck for a moment, then walked toward me. "Man, I'm glad I didn't hook that truck up." I smiled slightly. "Me too." He shook his head. "I've seen HOA drama before. But this?" He pointed toward the street where the police cars had disappeared. That lady really thought she owned the place. I looked around the neighborhood. The houses. The street. The lake road in the distance. Then I said quietly, "That's the problem." He climbed back into his tow truck. Before he closed the door, he looked at me again. "So what happens now?" I thought about it for a moment. Then I said the line my grandfather used to say about this land. "The same thing that should have been happening all along." He nodded. "And what's that?" I looked down the quiet street. "People minding their own property." The truck started. He drove away slowly. The construction lights still lit the yard. Inside the house, the renovation tools were still scattered everywhere. The broken door would need to be replaced tomorrow, but the street felt different now. Quieter. A few neighbors slowly went back inside their homes. One older man across the road raised his hand slightly. "Didn't know you owned all this," he called out. I smiled. "Most people didn't." He nodded thoughtfully. "Well, glad someone reasonable does." I laughed softly. "I hope so." He went back inside. The streetlights buzzed quietly above the road. I looked out toward the dark lake at the end of the property. That land had been in my family for decades before the developers ever showed up. Buying it back had taken everything I had. But moments like tonight reminded me why it mattered. Nobody gets to tell you that you don't belong on your own land. Not a fake HOA, not a power-hungry neighbor, not anyone. Because some things are simple, and some things are worth protecting, especially the place you call home.